This podcast was recorded at 9:30 a.m., Tuesday, February 16th, 2021.
This is Reformasi Weekly Dispatch. I'm Jeff Hutton.
And I'm Kevin O'Rourke.
Today, implementing regulations for the Omnibus are imminent. Chamber of Commerce wants to help distribute vaccine. Jokowi Widodo sliding poll numbers. And is it river naturalization or is it river normalization? Hello and welcome back to Reformasi Weekly Dispatch. Today, we talk about Jakarta Provincial Governor Anies Baswedan. He's promised a softer touch when it comes to fixing the capital's canals and rivers, promising to keep evictions at a minimum and the ongoing struggle to keep the floodwaters at bay. But the opposition says flood abatement has stalled, accusing the governor of posturing. The city of 10 million is still vulnerable to the same flooding that disproportionately impacts the poor. Good morning from soggy, dark, damp Jakarta. Kevin, how are you? How was your weekend?
Just fine, thanks.
Good
to be back.
You catch any of the ongoing drama, the impeachment that wasn't?
Yeah, I definitely follow that. Yeah, there's never a dull moment.
Who needs Netflix, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's get into it. Finance Minister Sri Mulyani has told the Jakarta Foreign Correspondents Club that President Jokowi Widodo will be issuing decrees to finally implement what's been termed the Omnibus. I remember it was Omnibus Bill, and now it's just the Omnibus. And for those unfamiliar, it's a collection of reforms, isn't it? It includes big changes to the labor law. And specifically what we're really worried about, or what we're interested in rather, is the degree to which it makes it easier to hire and fire workers. And I think termination payouts you've crunched the numbers here, but the termination payouts will more or less be half of the cost of what they were before, and short-term contracts, which were officially, technically a no-no after a certain amount of time, they'll be allowed indefinitely. Do I have that more or less right? Like the big takeaways from the Omnibus?
That's right, yeah. And a huge number of Indonesians, the bulk of the working age population, is toiling in the informal sector with no protections, no benefits whatsoever. So there's a huge need to transfer this group into the formal sector, where things are regulated and there are some benefits and some protections. But what has been obstructing that progress to date has been excessive rigidity in the 2003 labor law, which was written for and really by a group of unions that represent a tiny minority of the working age population. And the law mainly focuses on ensuring extremely tight job security and relatively strong benefits for that tiny group, which is great for them. But the unintended consequence is that it served to deter investment that might have created jobs for the vastly greater number of people that need good jobs.
Right. I mean, it was prohibitively expensive. And I wrote a story a couple months ago on this topic. And apparently, if you catch someone stealing and you have cause to fire them, you still, according to the laws then, you had to keep them on the payroll. And you could not fire them unless you got a conviction in court. Mm-hmm. And even then, you had to pay out termination.
Yeah, that's right. And that wasn't even the worst of it. The main thing is that for little companies, like garment makers and footwear companies that need to be able to be nimble, they need to go in and out of business and move with the fashions and the trends and orders from big clients, which are always turbulent. Right. It didn't provide them with the flexibility they need. Those companies, the vast portion of their current cash costs are salaries to their workers. And the way the law stood was that as soon as the company is in trouble, precisely because it runs out of cash. At that point, when it has to shut down, it must pay vast amounts of severance or job loss compensation to the workers, which it can't possibly do because it wouldn't be in that position if it had the cash. So then what happens is the managers who are very often from another country, Taiwan or South Korea or Hong Kong, they would just flee in the middle of the night, and then nobody would get any benefits whatsoever. So there's been a study that shows that formal sector workers entitled to benefits by the labor law very rarely ever received what they were supposed to get anyway. So this whole debate that's been going on for 18 years now has been very notional and ideological, because it doesn't really pertain to the actual results in practice. So anyway, now there's a implementing regulation which puts through some pretty big changes, not as sweeping as initially envisioned. So in order to fire a worker, there's still going to need to be a process of 3 warning letters in most cases. But at least the job loss compensation levels, which had been the 3rd highest in the world after Sierra Leone and Mauritius, will come down to be mid-range, on par with a lot of other emerging market economies. And that's positive. And then short-term contracts are going to be easier to work with, so that there is going to be a lot more flexibility in this new regulation, which looks like it should come out any day now.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the working age population, as you say, works in the informal sector. I think I saw a World Bank study or some data from the World Bank that said that something in the order of only 20% of the non-agricultural sector workers are actually in the formal sector. They're getting salaries monthly that are taxed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's about, before the pandemic, it was about 9 million people from a working age population of about 165 million. But among those 9 million in the formal sector, no more than half, maybe only a third, were in unions. And it's really only the unionized workers who got most of the benefits promised to them by the 2003 labor law. So you're talking about a situation where the benefits being received by 3 million workers are holding the other 169 million hostage.
If you were to think about the headaches that a foreign investor would have to weigh or would have to navigate before they set up a factory making Nike shoes here, where does this issue sit in that sort of that constellation of hurdles that they would have to navigate? You think is it the most important midway?
Right. Yeah, it's up there. It depends on the investor and the nature of their business. And it also crucially depends on whether the investor is a longstanding incumbent with a profitable enterprise, or whether it's a potential newcomer. Those are the ones that are really affected, and those are the ones that precisely lack any voice in the policymaking discussion, because they're literally not even in Indonesia. They're these small and medium enterprises from Taiwan, typically South Korea. Yeah, because if you're a big player, like the classic example is the U.S. toy company Mattel. They've been operating on a huge scale in Indonesia for decades, and they know what they're doing, and they've cultivated a very skilled workforce over the years. So these labor law issues are not a problem for them, because they're not using minimum wage workers. They don't have a lot of turnover. So they've been okay. But it's the new entrants are the ones that Indonesia needs to create jobs, to employ these people. And for them, it's probably the biggest issue, although there are other issues, land acquisition, logistics, and corruption, graft. But these are, and then power supply has always been a problem in a lot of areas. But all these other issues are gradually improving, actually, especially if you look at a province like Central Java. So addressing this labor market flexibility is right now actually more crucial than ever, I think, especially considering that you've got manufacturers from North Asia potentially relocating.
If we look at this from the labor point of view, I think that there's a certain amount of empathy that needs to be had here, because it does look like you're taking stuff away. The hope was you could get one of these these contracts. They're almost like a Willy Wonka golden ticket. That right, and in it, that was the hope and dream, and now that's been taken away. What do you think the government ought to be doing to demonstrate to Indonesian workers that, look, there's something in this for you. You are better off in this. And I thought one of those things was unemployment insurance. Like we are making the system work for you, as opposed to like this gilded, club, this exclusive club that that you can maybe hope and dream to once enter, but probably never will.
Right. Yeah. That was precisely part of the rationale for the 2003 law originally, was the fact that there were simply no government safety net schemes available. So therefore, it should be incumbent on employers to take care of their workers. Since then, there's been a proliferation of safety net schemes, and not just the newest one, which is Kartu Prakerja, which is basically technically what it's supposed to be is for somebody who's finished a vocational school and is in a job hunt. It gives them a stipend each month for a few months to fund their transition. But there's also a job loss insurance component. But there's also better pension programs and especially better health insurance.
That's right. And that's the big difference. It's replacing a law that was crafted right after the Asian crisis and in the fallout of the banking crisis, when you were really on your own.
Yeah. So what's encouraging is that it seems as if the confederations of labor unions are not attempting to fight this imminent implementation regulation. Instead, they're pitting their hopes on overturning the entire Omnibus Law itself in a hearing in the Constitutional Court, which is due to happen reportedly in April.
Right. Yeah, I was meaning to ask you about that, about the likelihood of being overturned in the Constitutional Court, not the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court. How does that seem? It's going to be challenged. I mean, they're going to challenge it.
Yeah, the challenges have already been filed. Yeah, so they're scheduled for April, and it's a vast law. The Omnibus Law rewrites over 70 other laws, and the 9 justices of the Constitutional Court have the ability to pick and choose what elements they want to strike down or even basically rewrite. So there will be changes made to the Omnibus Law by the Constitutional Court. I'm pretty sure of that. The question is whether they're substantial and whether they're going to pertain to these labor market flexibility issues. And I don't think that they will, because the labor market issues are the things that the president cares about most. And he's really worked hard to butter up these justices over the past year. 3 of them are his own appointees, but another 3 are appointees of Parliament, and the final 3 are the appointees of the Supreme Court. So, for example, he gave out very coveted National Service Medals of Honor, like rewards, to these other 6 justices whom he did not appoint. And he's also approved the passage of a revision of the Constitutional Court law, which makes life better for the justices. It expands their tenure and it gives them more power. So they really owe him big time, and this is what he wants. So it's a very unseemly way to go about governing. But the fact is that these labor market flexibility rules should pass through the Constitutional Court.
Before we move on, I just wanted to ask you in parenthesis, we're talking about a decree to implement a law. I actually am not quite sure about the mechanics at play here. So once a bill is passed by Parliament under the Indonesian system, what has to happen then before it becomes an enacted law? I know it becomes a law, but there's a second step there. At least
it's just a matter of detail, actually. Typically, lots of times the parties in Parliament are unable to resolve the technical, more substantive minutiae. Also, lots of times they're unwilling politically to wrangle over really fundamental key issues. And in either case, what they tend to do is delegate it to a lower level implementing regulation, typically a government regulation or a PP, but sometimes a presidential decree or per press. And so, therefore, basically, it's a way to kick the ball back to the administration, and then the president has the authority to decide on the matter through a implementing decree, a PP or a per press that he issues. But that process can be contentious because there's still a lot of access for special interests to lobby the policymakers who are writing these decrees, and they undergo drafting by different ministries, and each ministry has its own set of stakeholders that are lobbying, and it can be contentious and protracted. And so that's exactly what has been happening over the past 3 months. The latest sign is that these labor market flexibility rules are going to come out in a form which is quite promising for investors and the manufacturing sector and the economy as a whole, and job creation. But it's not entirely a done deal until the written thing actually shows up.
It occurs to me, I remember an issue where there were competing versions of the bill. There was something that was passed in Parliament, and then somebody else had a different copy, and they were different by 100 pages or so, and it was a really big bill.
It was a full-on mess. Yeah, the omnibus bill drafting process clearly overwhelmed the ability of Parliament to manage a document of that size. It was a bill of about 1,000 pages, and it covered, as I mentioned, over 70 laws. And so there's massive interests involved at all different parts of it. And so it really was handled very poorly. And so the parties voted on the bill and passed it formally in a General Assembly session of the full Parliament on a Monday. And the version that they had been told they were voting on differs substantially from the version that Parliament's leadership then sent to the presidential palace for the president's signature. So it's not really the way it ought to work, but that's what happened.
Okay, and it was still on the level, so to speak. It was not. There wasn't any skullduggery there.
Skullduggery and a lot more besides.
Sleight of hand.
There was that. There was everything, and incompetence and typos and formatting errors and wrong page sizes in the printer and everything. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
Okay, well, it was the first of its kind, though. I don't think Indonesia has ever passed an omnibus bill of this size, as you say, 1,000 or so pages.
Right, and so that itself is an issue because nowhere in the Constitution or the law on writing laws, there is a law on writing laws. It's called the law on writing laws. That thing doesn't mention an omnibus. So the opponents are filing a complaint to the Constitutional Court saying no such thing as an omnibus has or should or can exist in Indonesia. And they have a fair case to make on that point. This is something that Americans use, and I think it was maybe Luhut Panjaitan or some other minister basically latched onto the idea and tried it out here. So it remains to be seen whether it's going to be valid. But as I mentioned, I don't think the 9 justices of the court have the courage to strike down the entire omnibus law after all the work that's gone into it and all the effort that the president himself has put into it.
Okay, we'll just leave that to one side for the moment. We'll watch this space. Moving on to, well, it's sort of COVID adjacent. I thought this is an interesting development of the ongoing pandemic. The Indonesian Chamber of Commerce Chair Rosan Roslani has announced the organization KADIN will begin distributing COVID-19 vaccinations to corporates who register for it. So basically, the Chamber of Commerce is going to start handing out vaccines to corporates. Is that how on the plus side, I sort of see the utility of it. Just get the companies to come get their vaccines and you take care of your people. So that gets 20 million people off. But then the relatively rich and the secure get a fast track for the vaccine while everyone else has to wait.
Yeah, this is the rich jumping the queue. There's no two ways about it.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, this is the rich jumping the queue. Even if in a scenario in which KADIN is bringing in supplies of vaccine that the government never would have had access to otherwise, which is highly dubious. Even in that scenario, the perception is still going to be the rich jumping the queue. There's no way around that, and it's going to be contentious, and it's going to make the president look bad, and it's going to leave a bitter feeling all the way around if it actually happens. I mean, this may all be a moot point because it's not at all clear that KADIN is going to find any vaccine supplies out there in the world to import. But nonetheless, even if it is a moot point, it's already distracting policymakers who should be focusing 110% of their time right now on the distribution logistics of rolling out vaccination, which requires vaccination teams and seamless production, and especially cold chain logistics into rural areas. And that's an effort that requires a monumental focus. But instead of being laser focused just on that, right now policymakers are having to deal with this request from KADIN for their corporate employees to jump the line and not have to wait the extra months that it might take to get the government vaccination.
You can see a scenario where the C-suite gets vaccinated, and sort of the urgency sort of comes off after that.
I can see a lot of scenarios. I can see a scenario where somebody in KADIN gets a big supply of vaccines, supposedly for a certain number of corporate employees who never see it, but instead there's transactions taking place in parking lots with very wealthy people who pay 10 times the standard price, and the profits go somewhere.
Right.
There's a lot of things that can go wrong with this. Yeah.
Right. And you said that you don't know where you get the vaccines for now, but there's Sputnik, which apparently, but actually it's pretty effective. There was a study in the UK, right, that just came out, 92% or so. I mean, I'll take it.
No, yeah. So the Sputnik appears to be a good vaccine. In fact, it appears to be quite clever.
We just didn't know that yet.
Yeah. Well, for the first time, finally, there were some interim phase 3 trials, which. The Russians have been using this for 6 months now.
Yeah,
the interim trials finally come out. But what's clever about it is that it's a 2-dose vaccine that uses an attenuated SARS-CoV virus, if I'm not mistaken. But each of the doses uses slightly different material. And that's to basically persuade the body to make an immune reaction, because lots of times with these attenuated coronavirus vaccines, the recipient, their immune system thinks that they've seen this before. They think that the immune system thinks that this is the common cold coronavirus that they already had when they were a kid, so it's nothing to worry about. And so they end up catching COVID even though they've been vaccinated. So this Russian Sputnik virus, actually, the 2 doses have slightly different formulations of the same attenuated coronavirus particles. And so therefore, if the one doesn't work, then the other one will trigger the response. And so that makes it very effective. What's interesting also is that to do this, it requires quite a lot of material in the dose. So therefore, there's quite a lot of manufacturing effort that has to go into it, which means that the producer, Gamaleya in Russia, I don't think they're going to be able to churn out vast quantities of this vaccine. And there's already a few countries that have ordered big quantities, Mexico, Brazil, Hungary. So where KADIN fits on the pecking order, I don't know.
Well, money talks. But I want to sort of buttonhole you here a little bit. Is there, in your view, a role for the private sector in the distribution of vaccine? And if so, what's the best way to do it? No, not at all?
No. Well, I mean, the best way, sure. I mean, if the private sector is really chomping at the bit to help, then they should, A, pay their taxes, and B, if they still want to help some more, then make contributions to the government to buy these vaccines and to speed up the program, or make other contributions to helping the vaccine rollout. Contribute refrigerated vehicles. That's what everybody needs. But money is not the issue. Sri Mulyani said so last week. She noted that Australia gave Indonesia $1.5 billion for this type of thing. Other bilateral, multilateral agencies have also made resources available. And right now, the central bank is buying government debt. And the government didn't even succeed in spending the COVID relief funds that it allocated entirely for 2020. So, and these vaccines are not that expensive. So
No.
money is not an issue. That's not so KADIN is saying, we're going to be able to pay a market price, and therefore vaccination will happen faster than it would otherwise. Well, that's not really true, I don't think. I don't see a role for them. They should not do this. Now, that's from the macro perspective. Right now, if somebody comes to me and says, I own a company, should I register for the KADIN program? My advice would be yes. Go ahead, sign up.
Yeah.
Why not? You might get vaccinated early, and the program is good because on the registration form, it seems to imply that if you sign up, you have to sign up for all of your employees, and not just the directors. And it also seems to imply that you can also get vaccines for your employees' relatives. So those are good features of the program, but still, it's better off if the government were to take care of this.
See, well, that's what I thought. It was a bit more benign than your take. I thought it was a way of distributing the vaccine. If you've got company like Pertamina has, 20,000 or so employees, or let's say Gojek, they've got 200,000 drivers, and they just the government could turn to the Grabs and the Gojeks of the world and say, "Hey, you vaccinate your drivers and their families. We'll sell you the kit. Don't worry about it. We'll give it to you. We'll sell it to you at the right amount, at the market. Well, not the market rate, the prescribed amount. No skullduggery there, but you take care of it because we've got the rest of the country to take care of." I just thought it would be a way of freeing up bandwidth.
Yeah,
I'm just too naive.
The control, the control factor breaks down. You have to trust these companies to handle the process properly. It's something that they're not accustomed to doing. They don't have the skills and the expertise or the vaccinators on hand. They may not have the facilities and the space and the stadiums or the parks to use. So and then you've got two different recording systems now. So if somebody's already got their vaccine through Gojek, and then their neighborhood officials come around to vaccinate people, how do they differentiate the ones that already got vaccinated with their company versus the ones from the neighborhood officials? It's an unnecessary layer of complication, and I think the whole thing would go smoother and therefore faster if it was under solitary control of the health ministry.
Right. Okay. And the health ministry is under solid control.
Right. Yeah. There's a new minister now, so yeah, right. And they're getting their act together, I think. Yeah.
Right. Oh, I've got a question for you. What is gotong royong?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's another funny thing about this. So initially, this private sector Chamber of Commerce vaccination program was going to be called Vaccine Mandiri, which is translated as self-sufficient vaccine or self-vaccinating, basically. But then they changed that to Vaccine Gotong Royong. And that's a Javanese expression, which is a part of the traditional lore of Java, and it refers to mutual self-help among impoverished families. So it was a strategy honed over the centuries for communities grappling with poverty to rely on their own resources to help one another. So if you're really on the edge, you turn to a neighbor or then your neighborhood group, and people share what they have to collectively get through. So it's precisely the opposite of what this is, which is the rich cutting the queue.
Right. Okay. It's a little bit Orwellian. Well,
Yeah.
Moving on to opinion polls. It's a little, yeah, right. Love is war. Moving on to opinion polls here. Indicator Survey has a new poll out. It's got good news and bad news. The bad news is that he's down 7 points. The good news is that he's got a level of approval that I think virtually every elected leader on earth that's been
Right.
honestly elected would be very envious of. Something in 63% apparently think
Yes.
he's doing all right. And he's 7 years into the job. He's been in politics since 2005. Not a bad level really to be at? I don't know. I'm asking you, but do we have enough? I mean, on the face of it, it's a pretty good result. And
Right. Yeah.
the hit, right? I mean, and the hit is understandable given that we're a year into COVID and we're in a recession. Do we have enough framework for reference, though? We only have Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono to compare with. Do we have an idea of whether 63% is good or bad?
It's Widodo's worst ever. So there's two ways of looking at it. One is 63 is a very high number, as you mentioned, by world standards. But if you look at Widodo's polling since, if you start after he was in office for about 4 or 5 months, if you start from first half of 2015, it's his floor is it's as low as he's ever been. He touched this level a couple of times over the years, but then bounced back up to around as high as 72%, I think, in these Indicator Politik time series polls. So depends how you look at it. It's just interesting that he had been holding up pretty well, but then just finally started to dip in the past couple of months, and I think that coincides with the spiking of the cases that occurred in the first half of January. This poll took place from 1 to 3 February. And also around that time, hospitals, especially in urban areas, were full, and there's a lot of distress among the public about what to do if they get sick because the hospital space was running out.
How reliable is the poll?
Well,
because I think it's a telephone poll, right?
Yeah. So during the pandemic, it's not possible to do face-to-face interviews, which is what these polling companies had always done in the past, which made them quite reliable. So now what these polling companies are doing is they're drawing on their database of contact information that they compiled from their previous face-to-face polls when they found people in public at random and interviewed them and took down their contact details. Now they're re-polling those same people, but they're doing it by cell phone. It's the best possible alternative. But what it does is it misses out on about 25 or 30% of the population who are too poor to own a cell phone. And so therefore, this skews more towards a middle class, upper middle class view of the world.
What's his base? How do the poor see him versus the middle and upper classes?
Well, it's pretty uniform throughout, actually. He polls well, typically in the past across all those segments. So for that particular question about his satisfaction with his job performance, it may not matter that much.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if more or less the poor and the very poor are being systematically excluded from the poll. Wondering if that's skewing the results one way or the other.
Right. Yeah, it's possible. Especially the dips and spikes would probably be smoothed out if it was a genuinely representative nationwide sample. Whereas when you tend to skew more towards somewhat higher income groups that maybe are processing more information, you'll get more volatility in the results over time.
Does he have much more of an agenda to push through? I mean, the 63%, we have to see, I take your point. I mean, we have to see it from the Indonesian context and from his personal track record so far. But how much more is there left for him to get through? We've got the Omnibus bill done, infrastructure. He's got basically COVID to go. Is he at risk of not getting any more of his agenda through for the remaining 3 years?
Well, yeah. His agenda has always had some massive gaps in it to begin with. That's the problem, especially when it comes to governance and democratization in particular, fundamental institutional reforms. And there's been some setbacks in those areas. In late 2019, Widodo allowed for the Independent Anti-Corruption Commission, the KPK, to virtually become a department of the National Police Force with an active 3-star police general as its chair, which has really hampered the commission's performance. And Widodo has hollowed out the political opposition. And so he's gone to great lengths to barter away cabinet seats and compromise the quality of policymaking in order to give sinecures and entice opposition parties into his administration, which has been comfortable for him because there's basically no formidable opposition right now. By the same token, it's damaged policymaking, and it's made politics very dull. And there's a lack of dynamics in democracy right now. And then there's the democratization agenda itself, which is also suffering a setback because of what we discussed in last week's podcast about the president's decision to opt for skipping regional head elections in 2022 and 2023, which are crucial pillars of Indonesia's democratization. And then finally, there's the really big thing in my mind is reform of the bureaucracy or civil service reform, putting meritocracy into the state apparatus. That's something that Widodo has largely neglected to date. However, the glimmer of hope is that he has mentioned it on a couple of occasions as being his next agenda item. So it's something that there could be a few things in the works, and so there is some potential there for that.
The ultimate golden ticket, the ultimate Willy Wonka, getting a job in the civil service. Is it as corrupt as I've been led to believe, that you sometimes have to pay to get positions, and say as
right?
A police?
Yeah. At the low point, it was certainly that way. If you go back 10 or 15 years, definitely, yeah. I think that the civil service entrance exam very often went to the highest bidder, and therefore you had a system that filtered out people with integrity right from the very start of their careers, and then it only got worse. But yeah, I always emphasize that most civil servants are definitely good. They work hard and they're working for the public and they're doing their best and they're working under tremendous adversity. It's the old 20-80 rule. 20% is creating 80% of the problems. So there's a real definite need to winnow out the worst aspects of the civil service, the few individuals who are abusing the system. And then to properly motivate and reward the remainder to keep them focused on performance rather than distracting them with the patronage style mechanisms that govern the civil service at present.
Okay, and last up, river normalization versus river naturalization. We are in the middle of rainy season, and I remember way back when, I think it's 2013, when Bundaran Hai was under very brown, silty, cruddy water for days because of flooding. And this was a massive embarrassment for the capital. And also, it is ruinous for businesses, and in particular, the poor, who tend to live in low-lying areas. And they were really hammered. And even just last year, several dozen people died in flash floods that could have been better managed had there been early warning systems. They were in place. I just don't think that they were executed. Now, Anies Baswedan came to power in part back in 2017 on a promise of a no tiers policy, no mandatory evictions for big public works, and these are the river straightening, putting, cement down to buttress the banks, clearing away the slums that tend to amass along the riverbeds, but act to obstruct drainage. And this causes a bit of backup, especially when there's heavy rain, which happens quite a lot in Jakarta. But the softly approach has meant that a lot of work has come to a standstill. There's something like 34 kilometers of river that has yet to be naturalized or normalized one way or the other. I was wondering if you could give me if you can parse the difference between normalization and naturalization and what's at stake here. Because it is actually, if flooding is probably one of the big issues driving this desire to move the capital, isn't it? Because the city's flooding and it's at risk for natural disasters.
Yeah. Yeah, and these floods in Jakarta are tragic, and sadly, they're ultimately avoidable in a lot of cases. Yeah, they can be very deadly, or just disruptive, or they can just breed misery for vast numbers of people. And even when the floods don't happen, people are living on tenterhooks because they're worried every time there's a cloud that in the middle of the night they're going to wake up with a wet floor. So when Ahok, Basuki Pranama, was running for re-election in 2017, he had been conducting resettlement processes for communities that were typically squatting illegally on land that needed to be renovated, either solidifying embankments of waterways with concrete or expanding reservoirs to collect rainwater, that sort of thing. And the resettlements, I think, were handled well. Pranama made a point of making sure that multi-story affordable housing units were available before the resettlement happened, and there were numerous complexes of these structures built to handle the resettlement. But nonetheless, there was a lot of distress, and there was a lot of misinformation in a lot of communities in Jakarta about forced evictions. And Baswedan definitely capitalized on that fear in order to oust Pranama from the governorship. At the time, there was the blasphemy case that is always the focus of attention. But when looking at the poll figures, the blasphemy case didn't really move the polls that much. It was the rhetoric around forced evictions, I think, that predated the whole blasphemy problem that started in December 2016. And there was one particular case in Kampung Melayu near Bidara, China, in East Jakarta, involving the Otista Drain, which channels the Ciliwung River, one of the biggest of Jakarta's 15 or so rivers. There was a project that provided 2 giant overflow drains to channel overflow from that river into the eastern Jakarta flood canal, which is a huge structure built at great expense 20 years ago, and which is underutilized. And that project involves resettlement for a stretch of land, basically one street, about 600 meters in length. And the community was whipped up into a frenzy by Yusril Mahendra, a former minister and head of an Islamic party who backed Baswedan. And he's a very wily operator. And so that was a huge election campaign issue. And there was a lot of fears about forced evictions being whipped up, and the focus of the apprehension and fury focused on normalization, which is the term used for rebuilding rivers this way with resettlement processes. So now, Baswedan won't do. Yeah.
Right. Resettlement and right. And I just wanted to sort of define normalization versus naturalization, because that's really in the political discourse here. So naturalization is what? Planting trees? There's a bit of grass cover there. What do they mean by that?
Right. Well, there is a definition. Naturalization is, quote unquote, managing water infrastructure through the concept of open green area development while simultaneously heating absorption capacity, flood control, and conservation. That is according to a.
Well, I could see that, right? I mean, you do want more open space to act as natural drainage. I get that.
Yeah, ironically,
but you also need to clear out
that approach done properly involves more resettlement, not less. So there's been neither normalization nor naturalization during Baswedan's tenure to date.
And that's the point.
Yeah.
He actually hasn't done very much. And so I don't have any data at all. I don't know if you've seen it, but how are we going for floods, or has he been lucky in terms of bad weather?
I guess drainage in Jakarta is so horrible that the good news is that it's quite easy to make progress. There's a lot of different ways to improve the situation because the situation is so horrible. Okay. So Baswedan's administration has been doing a lot of other stuff. And what they're mainly focusing on is what's called polder systems. So this is something that came from Holland, where vast areas involve...
What's it, polder?
Polder,
like
with a P.
It's boulder, but with a P.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so a community which is living below sea level is typically in a polder system, which involves a few different things. One is a basin to collect rainwater, um, dikes to hold back tides or floods, and crucially, pumping systems to move water out of the community into a drainage canal. And so the Jakarta is a huge patchwork of polders, basically, and they need lots of upgrading and expanding and improvement. And so that's where the administration has been focusing, and that's good. I mean, Jakarta needs both. They need better polder systems, but they also ultimately are going to need normalization of these rivers and reconstructing these canals and riverways, because lots of times these rivers are winding around in these big, huge loops, and as an opportunity to build a canal to link two loops and remove bends that cause overflow, and without those bends, then the water can flow faster. So, but that involves digging and resettling, so it doesn't happen.
So the focus on the pumps and the dikes is really sort of kicking the can down the road, so you don't have to grasp that nettle of resettlement of your voter base.
Yeah, it's sort of a patchwork solution, and it's temporary, and it's a solution that involves a huge amount of maintenance and expenditure to keep those pumps operating, because it's very easy for these machines to break down when the storm finally arrives. Whereas if there was a proper system of rainwater collection, green spaces, and properly dredged and constructed rivers and canals that were not obstructed by garbage and settlements and loops, then it would be possible to avoid flooding without having to construct massive polder systems everywhere.
Welcome back to Reformasi Weekly Dispatch. We're going to broaden out our discussion on flood management in the capital with our next guest. Michael Sianipar is the chairman of the Jakarta Chapter of the PSI, the Indonesian Solidarity Party. Welcome to the pod, Michael.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you for welcoming me.
Thrilled to have you. Michael, I wanted to start things off here just for the sake of listeners outside of Jakarta who aren't familiar with the word banjir. Why is it so significant? Why, it's just as an election issue, as a quality of life issue, why is it important for the capital, for Jakarta in particular, to get a hold of this issue, to come to terms with flood management?
Yeah, it is very crucial for Jakarta to be able to mitigate flooding issues, because first of all, whenever big flood happens, it halts the economic activities, because we would have hundreds of thousands of refugees, and then if the roads are flooded, then it's difficult for people to commute. You have traffic everywhere, and even days of office workers cannot have activities. So I think that's the first part. The economy, there's an economic impact of flooding and the social impact of the refugees issues as well during flooding. And it is also important because Jakarta is the capital city. So it's not just a city that grinds to a halt when there's a flooding, but it's the economic center and the political center, the power center of Indonesia. And it also projects an image of the progress of our country. So if we still have flooding every year, and especially if it's a major flooding, then it's a public relations disaster for the country as well.
So, Michael, how do you assess the governor's performance on this particular issue so far?
Yeah, I think he's doing a bad job in flood mitigation. I don't think he's putting a priority to handle flood.
What's the remedy?
Well, I was in the governor's office during the previous governor's term, Basuki Cahayapurnama and Mr. Jokowi as well, when he was governor. So I know what it's like from the executive branch in Jakarta. And we always have solutions to flooding issues. I mean, there has always been blueprints to how to mitigate heavy rainfall and flood that comes from upstream from Bogor, and how to build the giant seawall and also river embankment. I mean, there are a lot of proposals and solutions on the governor's table every single year, whoever the governor is. It's always the matter of execution, because in Jakarta, one of the key issues is it's already very messy, a very messy city where you have squatters by the riverbank, and then just the zoning of the city has been messy as well from decades ago, and it takes courage, it takes leadership to do something about it, because every solution that you want to implement, we don't like solutions, but every solution that a governor takes will make some groups of people unhappy, because there's consequence to any solution. There's a trade-off.
So, Michael, in the pod earlier, we were discussing the differences between river normalization versus naturalization. And what I noticed is that the governor has basically opposed or resisted normalization, and yet, if I'm not mistaken, has yet to really implement naturalization. Is that right?
That's correct. So this is a question that has been asked for 3 years, from the first time that the term naturalization was brought up. It is still unclear what that looks like, and it has not been implemented in Jakarta. So we don't really have a comparison of what is the difference between normalization and naturalization, because there's nothing to compare.
It sounds to me like you're accusing the administration of basically kicking the can down the road. That naturalization is just a byword for low-hanging fruit, taking the easy steps and not making the hard decisions, like evicting squatters. That could be politically damaging. Is that that is a fine point, I know, but is that basically the crux of your argument?
I think it is more than just that. Well, from what I heard of what naturalization is, I think the governor, at times, if I remember correctly, either him or his agency had, but pointed out to the example of Singapore. Singapore has done what is called naturalization. They try to bring back the ecosystem to their rivers, which is honestly a great idea. I think we need not just a river with concrete, but if it can look more like rivers in the past, where there is like greeneries, not just concrete on the embankment. That is great. But I think if we really want to implement that, the costs and the difficulty is actually a lot bigger. So the concept of naturalization is not an easy way out. It is actually much more complex if it is being done according to the original concept, like in Singapore. But so I think the reason why the governor brought it up is because it is a great idea. Honestly, if it can be implemented, it is a great idea. It's not an easy way out. It is much more complex. But the thing is, how do you operate that? How do you bring that into realization? How do you not just widen a river and then build concrete, but you actually make the river looks more like a river? Like it's not just a straight line, but it goes like left and right, and then there are trees and things like that. It must be very beautiful, but it is just not realistic. At least we have not seen it in Jakarta.
So there's a lack of a plan.
I think the governor reportedly is focusing instead on upgrading Jakarta's polder systems with dikes and pumps and catchment basements. Is that what you're seeing too, or do you have doubts about that effort also?
So I think that is ongoing. So I would say that there is progress in that. We have bought a lot of land. So land banking for water catchment areas, as well as for reservoir closer to the sea. But the question is, are the places where these are constructed strategic, or these are just I wouldn't say random, but I'm not exactly sure if the locations that have been decided to build water reservoir are actually optimal. Because the thing is, there's also politics behind it. I'm just gonna open it up. there are a lot of political deals when it comes to land acquirement in Jakarta, land procurement. So there will be politicians who would come to the executive to sell land, and then the argument is, oh, you can make this land to be a cemetery, to be a park, or to be water catchment area. So the government ends up buying a lot of land, and they don't know what to do about it. So they would just decide, all right, we're going to make it into a reservoir or other things. So the strategic value of these locations are not really clear, but at least there's progress to.
It's quite haphazard.
Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead. Yes.
A little bit of tail wagging the dog there sometimes.
Right. So these are additional solutions, like all the water catchment areas, and then building reservoir all around the city, and then the sumur resapan. So there's like a well that catches water, so to speak. But I would still say that the primary solution to flooding is if we can normalize the river. I think we can come up with many other additional solutions. That is great. But don't forget the main issue here. The main issue is because we don't have big enough rivers that can flow water to the sea.
Look, I want to push back just a little bit here and just point out, maybe it's a truism, I don't know, but there just haven't been the floods that I remember 5 or 6 years ago. And it may have receded a little bit as an election issue. Is that not the case?
So I think the climate is weird because we actually have not seen heavy and prolonged rainfall in the past years. The rainfall that happened a week ago or 2 weeks ago, it was actually far less heavy than last year's New Year's rainfall. So I think the rainfall measurement was 180 millimeters a day. I think that is the term for what happened last week. But what happened last year was 300 millimeters, so almost twice as heavy. But the rain only happened for 1 day, whereas the big flooding that occurred in 2012 or 2013, it was I can't remember the data, but it was a prolonged rainfall, heavy rainfall. So we're just lucky. We have only been lucky. It's not because we have done a good job in flood mitigation. We have just been lucky.
Got it. Could we talk about PSI and how you're doing?
Sure.
Where does the party sit in the national sort of political firmament? Can you define, people outside Jakarta or outside Indonesia, what PSI stands for?
So in terms of ideology, well, Indonesian politics don't really talk about ideologies and even programs, honestly. But I think we're more in the middle left. We're more like the Democrats in the US, I think, because we do bring some socialist issues. Not that we're a socialist party, but we're more middle center to the left. But I would say that PSI looks more like the progressive party of the turn of the 19th to 20th century in the US. So I'm a big fan of history books, and I read a lot of American history. So there were two big parties, and there have always been two big parties in the US, Republicans and Democrats. But there was a time when there was a progressive movement. And the focus was to clean the government. And I think that's what we stand right now. We don't really talk much about our ideology. That's not the main point of our party, but we try to be very firm in battling corruption and intolerance.
And PSI has a strategic share of the Jakarta Provincial Assembly with about 7.5% of the seats. Did the party win comparable shares in any other regions around the country in 2019?
We have done well in big cities. So Jakarta, Surabaya, Bandung, Tangerang Selatan, South Tangerang, Medan. So in the big cities, in urban areas, we have been able to get our votes and win seats.
Okay, so yeah, those shares in the municipal assemblies in some of the big cities around the country, are those going to enable you to leverage into broader appeal, do you think, in 2024?
So I think there are two ways for our party to move forward. First, we can always focus on just getting as many votes as possible to pass the parliamentary threshold, which is 4%. But the second option, and this is what I would lean towards too, is to just focus on the urban areas. Even if we make it to 4% or not, hopefully, of course, we will be able to make it. But the core strength of our party constituency is in the urban areas. I think we are party of the future, and Indonesia is urbanizing, and we're still a young population. More and more people will go to urban centers, and the definition of urban centers will develop not just Jakarta and Surabaya, but maybe some other what is now smaller cities, but they will be bigger. And I think going forward, we should focus on becoming a local party, starting from the bottom up. If we can just win enough seats in the cities, and then we can elect mayors, and we can prove to the people that, yes, even though we're not like a party that has national figures in it, or a party that has a lot of resources, but if you give us a chance, like what happened in the cities, like in Jakarta, we're not the executive, but we have been very vocal as the opposition party. Then if you can trust us with the little things, just a few seats and maybe one or two mayoralty, we will prove to the country that we can do a lot more if given more trust.
All right. Okay. Yeah. And the good thing about that strategy is that there's no threshold that applies to the DPRDs, the regional assemblies. So it's possible to be a small player, unlike in Parliament, where there's that steep 4% parliamentary threshold that a new party like PSI has to climb over in order to occupy seats.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. All right. And how about... last question on PSI. As really the only party out there right now that's embracing reform, is that translating into an ability for the party to recruit young Indonesians into politics, or are you finding that politics is turning off the young generation?
So in general, it's always difficult for politics to reach young people in Indonesia, and I think not just in Indonesia, everywhere. But from what we have seen, at least in our party, we're still a small party. But for example, I'm still 29, and most of my party council, leadership in the party in Jakarta are 30 or at least 35 and below. So we're still very young in terms of our committee members. And also for our elected officials, there are 8 of them. The youngest is only 23, or maybe it's 24 by now. So half of them are below 30, or they're already 30. So we have been able to attract young politicians. That's one thing. Whether we can attract young voters in the future, more young voters, I think my main argument would be not that we're a fun party, or like we're a party that can relate to young people. I don't think that's enough. But we need to show that, look, we are a party where you can actually have a voice and do something, because you can get elected even if you're young in our party. Right. So the best example for the youth is to have some youth be an elected official, and that will show them that they are relevant, because not only they can give us votes, but they can actually be the candidate, and they can actually be the elected officials.
Right. Okay. And Michael, while we have you, I also wanted to ask you who you think the next governor is going to be in your city, in Jakarta. I think Anies Baswedan has a little over a year left, and then it's going to be a caretaker taking over. Any idea whom the government would appoint?
We don't know yet who the central government will appoint to be the caretaker governor. But yes, the Anies Baswedan has only less than 2 years, 1.5 years.
Okay. We'll sign off then. Yeah, I really appreciate it, Michael. That was great. Thanks for your insights. It was very interesting talking to you. And we'll give you a copy of the podcast and hope to have you back again next time.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you.
And that's the program. Thanks to Michael Sianipar of the Indonesian Solidarity Party and to my co-host, Kevin O'Rourke. Editing by Stephen Handoko, art by Ivan Cristiani, music by Blue Dot Sessions. For a free trial of the Reformasi Weekly Report, go to reformasi.info. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe. It helps. This podcast is a production on The Level Media. I'm Jeff Hutton. Bye for now.